I'm Netta Weinstein, and I'm a psychologist. I'm going to be taking a slightly different approach today. But I'm going to be speaking in a way that is very relevant to the previous talks we've heard today. So most of you probably know that the challenges of conservation are doing it, given limited resources and given increasing urbanization. And I think the earlier talks today spoke to both that issue and presented different ways to do it. What I'd like to do is take a different approach and argue, okay, well, why should we bother? And there are two reasons to, can you hear me in the back? I can kind of hear it. Okay, excellent. There are two reasons to conserve, to protect nature. One is we value nature. Nature is intrinsically important, and many of us believe that. Probably all of us in this room, to some degree, believe that. But there's a second reason as well, and that reason can be compelling as well. And that reason is that nature can also be important to people. So, as a psychologist, that is what I'm going to try to argue today, that potentially we might conserve nature because it is important to people. So, I've talked about conservation given increasing urbanization. Right now, more than 50% of the population are living in cities and urbanized environments, and that number is growing. Those environments are characterized by high population density, that is, a large number of people who live in a small area together. Cities are also characterized by higher diversity, that is, different kinds of people living together in a tight area. People from different backgrounds, different educations, different nations speaking different languages. And a lot of these communities also experience some kind of tensions that come from individuals living together who are not always similar to one another. Now, what are the risk factors to living in cities? There are several, and some of them are the risks to our value systems. That is, cities tend to promote selfish, high achievement values. Those day-to-day pressures that we experience to earn our living, to succeed at our work, to provide for our families, we tend to focus very much on ourselves when living in cities. And we do experience social pressures, deadlines, bills, things that we have to worry about for ourselves. Another risk factor, potentially, of living in cities is the absence of nature around us. Now, why does this matter? Why does it matter that when we live in cities, we have potentially less access to nature? Well, there's been a lot of research in psychology that has shown that nature is important for people's well-being, for people's sense of happiness, their experience of life as satisfying and fulfilling, for their energy levels, their vitality, as well as for their physical health, for how they experience physical symptoms and illness. Having nature around seems to make us happier, make us more satisfied with our lives, make us more energetic. So there are all these what we call personal benefits to having access to nature, benefits that we lose when we're disconnected from nature. However, potentially there's another benefit to nature, a benefit that we potentially lose being disconnected from nature, and that is to our relationships with other people. Today, what I'd like to hopefully show you, demonstrate, try to convince you of, is that having contact with nature is important for us to build healthy and happy relationships with other people. And theoretically, there's some reason to believe that. There's research both coming out of biophilia theory, which argues that people have an innate tendency to seek contact with nature, that they find nature inherently satisfying, as well as from psychological theory, that we believe that we can feel a sense of connection or relatedness to nature that satisfies us much in the way as connecting or relating to other people does. And these kinds of theories might lead us to expect that when we are in nature, we feel a sense of connection with the outside world. We feel a sense of connection, perhaps with others around us as well. And so nature, contact with nature, orients us outside of ourselves. It orients us to those things around us, to the plants around us, to life around us, in a way that perhaps makes us care for life around us more as well. Whereas on the other hand, being in cities orients us back into ourselves. We worry about our own pressures, our own responsibilities. We try to be as attractive as we can so that the many people around us are impressed by us and want to interact with us more. We try to be as wealthy as we can and drive our fancy cars. So it changes the way that we evaluate and value the different aspects of our lives. So being in cities focuses back inside of ourselves, whereas potentially nature allows us to feel a sense of connection with something outside of ourselves. And what I'd like to show you, so I do quantitative work, what I'd like to show you through a series of studies, mostly experiments, is that in fact that sense of connection, that sense of being able to go outside of ourselves actually has an impact in the way that we relate to others, in the way that we think and feel about others. Okay, so in the present research, what I'd like to hopefully convince you of is that nature exposure shapes human relationships by increasing our sense of closeness and caring for others, by increasing what we call our prosociality, so our tendency to be giving to others, to be generous to others, to contribute to society in a positive way. And actually as well that it can increase environmental concern in itself, so we might actually promote environmental concern by connecting people to nature. I'm just going to jump into a series of studies, and I'll take you a little bit through the methodologies and the type of conclusions that we might make from these data. So this is one example of a set of studies that we run. Psychologists like to bring people, especially students, into small confined areas and make them do tasks on computers. This is what we did here. So this is a basic visual representation of our lab. And in a study like this, in one condition, we randomly assign people to come into the lab, and it's essentially the lab as it would otherwise be. And the other one, we populate it with plants. So the idea is to bring nature a little bit inside. This is, an artificial simulation of what you might see in the real world. Another type of design we often tend to use is to show images to people. In one condition, students or participants might see images of natural environments. In another one, they might see urban environments. But I'll give you some results from a study that put people in a lab when plants were present or absent. What we did is once we brought them to the lab, we asked them a number of questions. And those questions tapped at what is most important to them in their lives. What are their most important values or goals? And we categorize these based on psychological theory into either selfish types of goals, for example, to be a very wealthy person, or generous types of values, to assist people who need it, asking nothing in return, to give back to community, to build relationships. We also wanted to see how does nature affect not just what people value, but what they do. So we gave them a chance to be either generous or selfish, using a basic economic game where they could either share money with another participant or keep it for themselves. Okay, what did we find? So in this graph, we basically see how important are people's life values to them. And here we're looking just at those relational values, like building relationships or giving back to the community. And what we see is when people are in nature, in our artificial natural environment, they tend to value those relational aspirations more. They tend to think it's more important to give back to the community, to build relationships. And we see a nice complementing effect for those selfish values. When people have nature around them, it seems they care less about being wealthy. They care less about being beautiful. Instead, again, they value those more prosocial or generous types of goals. And what we see is that then these values, these core beliefs that people have, they translate into behavior. When we give people the chance to either keep money from themselves and take it all home with them, or to share it with another person, those who are in nature are more likely to want to share with others. So those values, those things that we find important also translate to how we relate to others in a meaningful way, how we might potentially give back to others and society. Okay. So again, this is based on the idea that when we are in nature, we feel more of a sense of connection, general connection, general relatedness to the world around us. We are part of something bigger. When we're in cities, we turn in on ourselves. Now, we can apply this not just looking at other people broadly, but remember I said earlier that people in cities are struggling with the fact that they are living around individuals who are not just exactly like themselves, but who come from different countries, who speak different languages, who have different skin colors, different religions, different sets of beliefs. And what we see in psychology, a very common effect, is that those individuals who belong to what we call our in-group, these are the individuals who are just like us, who we perceive to be like us. That is, maybe this is going to be other people who share my religion. Maybe this is going to be, for me, other Americans. Those people who are in our in-group are favored. We tend to like them more than those people who are in our out-groups, who are dissimilar to us. Perhaps immigrants to America. Perhaps people who have a different educational background from me. And there's a very well-documented effect that in general, we tend to be more hostile and less generous to those who are dissimilar from us. Some of the striking results is, for example, children who belong to an out-group are less likely to receive needed care and support than those who belong to our in-group. If someone who is our neighbor or a family member requires some help, we're likely to provide it. But if someone, perhaps in another continent, is starving or impoverished, we are less likely to care about them. Okay. So we did a number of studies to look at how does nature affect not just those who are similar to us, but also those who are dissimilar. So in these studies, we specifically asked people to think about these two different types of individuals. Before we showed them these kinds of nature images versus urban images. So this is nature defined broadly. And we tried to match these images on things like color and shapes. This is one of my better examples, but this is this is an example of what we attempted to do. Now, in the study, we looked both before and after a manipulation at how close, how connected did people feel to someone else. And what we find is that when we are looking at urban environments, okay, so if we bring someone into an urban environment, these lines represent those people who are known to us, who are similar. How we define that is someone who is known to you, for example, a family member or a friend. So we find that actually both urban and natural environments can make us feel closer to those who we are already close to our family members. Perhaps if we take a stroll down the street next to our house with a family member, we have a nice conversation, we can still feel closer. We might get the same positive effect doing that in a forest. The really interesting effect happens when we compare natural and urban environments, and we ask people to think about someone who is unknown to you, who is foreign, who's different. In this case, we see that natural environments also promote a sense of closeness to those individuals. That is, if we are walking down a forest path with someone who we didn't know very well before, maybe who came from a different background, who speaks a different language, we might still feel a sense of connection with that person, just sharing that environment with them. On the other hand, in urban environments, we tend to feel slightly less close to those types of people. So in an environment that does not have nature in it, we tend to feel isolated and less caring potentially of individuals who are dissimilar to us. Nature can help ameliorate that effect. Now the question is, again, does this sense of closeness actually translate to a positive, generous type of behavior? So what we did here was we showed people natural and urban images again, and then we asked them to look at videos of starving children. These were American participants, either in the USA or in Africa. So these American children represent our in-groups. There are those who are similar to us, who come from a similar background, whereas African children represent our out-groups. We asked American students to do this, and then we asked them, how much were you able to take the perspective of these children? Okay, how much, and perspective taking is one form of empathy, that is one form of caring. And what we find is when we looked at urban environments, we see that basically those children who are from Africa American participants tended to not bother taking their perspective, as compared to when they were looking at American children. When they looked at American children who were starving, they said, wow, I really feel for them, and I can really see, why they're in trouble and why they need my help. But they did not feel that way with African children. The interesting thing was, in a natural environment, people felt that sense of caring and empathy, both to those who were like them and those children in Africa who needed help. They cared for both. And we asked them as well to not just say, how much do you feel this way? We also asked them to write a letter to their government representative, arguing in support for children both in Africa and in the USA. And we found that those who were in nature wrote really compelling, long letters, both for Americans, that is their in-groups, and for African children who were their out-groups. Whereas those who were exposed to a city environment only bothered to write compelling letters in support of an in-group American. They didn't bother doing it for the African children. So we see that nature not just helps us connect with people broadly and generally, but where it especially seems to have an effect is when you're looking at someone who is dissimilar to you. It helps us to sort of transcend those cultural boundaries that differentiate us and that keep us isolated from one another. So we wanted to take this research outside of the lab and outside of working with students to the real world, to a national sample. And so what I'd like to do is present to you data from a sample that is representative of the United Kingdom, that has a much more diverse age group and socioeconomic groups, so people from different income levels, different educations. What we did is we asked those people, how much exposure to nature do you have? And again, this is broadly defined. In this case, we said, think about your surroundings. How much are your surroundings characterized by either very built environments, like a city center, or how much are you surrounded by nature, for example, trees, fields, or water? And we asked them things like, how would you describe the view from your house, as one example of this. But we asked them a number of other questions about their local nature as well. And we, besides asking them about their exposure to nature, we also asked them about their feeling of connection with their neighbors, with other people in their community. So we asked them questions like, I care about other people in my neighborhood. I feel a sense of connection. I feel we are on the same team. I would bother helping them if they needed help, and I feel a sense of concern for my neighbors. So this is how much of a sense of closeness and community do we feel with those around us as a function of the neighbor around us. And the interesting thing is, across the board, what we found is that people who have nature around them, around where they live, they tend to show higher on all these indicators. All these indicators benefit from having nature around us. And that controls for how wealthy people are, how educated people are, their gender, their age, and a number of other important characteristics. So it's not just that, let's say, wealthy people have more nature around them and they care more about their neighbors, but actually independent of that, nature has a positive effect on a sense of community. But actually what is, to me, equally interesting is we didn't just ask about the amount of nature around them. We also asked, what is the quality of the local accessible nature? How easy is it to access the nature? And how often do you actually visit it? And we see that all of these things are independently important in predicting a sense of community. And actually it's really interesting that those who visit their local nature more feel more of a sense of community. So those people who actually spend more time out in their local nature feel a sense of closeness to their neighbors and a sense of concern for their neighbors. So we see here that having nature around us and actually visiting, spending time engaging in nature can help us to build better relationships with other people. A little bit counterintuitive, considering the fact that when we think about our relationships with other people, we always think that we would build those in a cafe, we would build those on a city street perhaps, or in a bookshop, but we don't always intuitively think if we go out where there are fewer people, we will actually care for people more, but it seems to be the case. Now, one interesting additional result that I found that came out of this is, I'm going to just take you a little bit through it, is comparing people's current experience of nature, how much nature they currently have around them, and how much nature they had around them when they were growing up. So this line represents people who, when they were children, had nature around them growing up. And what this shows is, if we look at those same indicators of community, the people who have a high level of nature currently all feel a sense of community. It didn't matter whether you had it or didn't have it growing up. But actually, if you look at those people who now reside in environments that do not have enough nature around them, we see that those people who didn't have nature either as children or adults, they feel a very low sense of community. But actually, those people who had some nature around them as children, they still get those benefits, even thinking about how close they feel to their neighbors right now. So actually, it seems like the experiences we have as children can carry over into adulthood and help us to build better relationships with other adults later on. Okay. So taking all of a whole set of bar charts into consideration, putting this all together, what does this all mean? Well, it seems like green infrastructure is important for having a sense of community. And having nature around us is important for having relationships with other people that are caring, that are close and intimate, and that are giving, as well as having stronger and more cohesive communities, not just small groups of individuals, but if we actually want to change the way that a city functions, the way that individuals in a city support one another and care for one another, we need to bring nature into those cities. And we see, I haven't presented these results, but we saw those results. So in the national sample, we sampled people from cities, from the center of London, as well as from rural environments where there's a lot of farming and so forth around. We saw those same effects across environments. It matters both in cities and in rural environments. And so this speaks to urban planning and urban lifestyle. If you are, and I think the talks today really spoke to that as well. If you're thinking of how you would like a functioning city to look like, nature is an essential part of that. But it also speaks to an urban lifestyle. If you have people living in cities, they will benefit if they go out of those cities every once in a while and they go to a reserve and they go on a retreat, or even if perhaps possibly if they visit local nature around them. So part of an urban lifestyle, it benefits from having nature incorporated, being part of it. And it seems like it's important then that we engage people with nature, that there are reasons not just in terms of the importance of nature intrinsically, but it's important for people and for society that we encourage people to engage with nature. That seems to be true both with children and adults. A lot of the results I showed you were focused on adults, but that last interaction suggested that actually your experiences as children carry over, that it's important to have it at all stages of life. And actually other research has shown that nature does benefit at least the well-being, the happiness, and satisfaction of children. And it seems like the relevance then of nature for our communities will only increase over time, because what's happening to our society? Well, our cities are only growing, and they're only becoming more diversified. We have a large amount of immigration into Europe. We need people who are different from one another to be able to live successfully side by side, and ideally to care for one another. If we want to create that kind of life, that kind of urban life, we need to maintain contact with nature through urbanization. Okay, so having said all of that, so I've hopefully argued to you that it is important for us that we conserve nature, not just for nature, but actually for people too. What I'd like to talk about is some psychology research that says, well, given that, how can we encourage people to conserve nature? How can we get people motivated and excited about caring for nature? And I'm going to argue to you that we can do that through people's values. At the same time, get them to care for other people, if we can activate these underlying beliefs. So I'm that, and one is direct. And we do that through priming, that is through directly reminding people that they have intrinsic values. I'll show you what I mean by that. And also indirectly through meaningful contact with nature. So again, making that argument that having contact with nature can actually help us to care for others and for the environment. How do we do it directly? Well, priming values is about reminding people that those values are there when we're making arguments to them that they should conserve nature. And we did a study where we tried to do that, and we did it together with the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, and SCOPE, which is a disability agency, so it works with people who have disabilities. So we were looking both at nature conservation causes and at pro-people causes. And what we did is we asked a whole bunch of members of both of those organizations who have elapsed, who haven't been giving anything to those organizations. Hey, maybe you could start again. Maybe you could give back a little bit more. And we manipulated the extent to which values were present, both in the phone call from telemarketers, that initial phone call, hey, I'm calling on behalf of WWF. We would like you to contribute to this ongoing cause. And we also manipulated it through our monthly texts. Every month they got a text that said, hey, this is WWF. We're just reminding you, here we are, this is our cause. Maybe you could donate a sum this month. Okay. Now, I'll give you a sense of what I mean by manipulating values. Well, we can have a message, this is an example of a text, that either has intrinsic values primed in it or not. In this case, we are trying to support tiger conservation. So we might send a message like, through my baby tiger, you can help us to keep precious tigers in the wild where they belong. This is a kind of message that people might get on their phone every month from the WWF, asking them to give a small sum this month. But we can add to that message values. We can imbue it with values. Tigers are an important part of our earth. We can help them to thrive. We can help them to grow and to flourish. We can work together to do that. So by using psychology terms that are related, directly linked to those values, we remind people, that value is in me down there somewhere. So what we did was we took, this is a business as usual text. This is what WWF said, okay, we're going to put that out there in our Baby Tiger campaign. We're going to send these texts out. We took out of their texts anything that had to do with intrinsic values, because they kind of hit the point home every now and then. So they had a bit of intrinsic values in there. So we took all of that out. So the control is completely devoid of intrinsic values. And then we also had like a super hyped up version of their text where we added a bunch of intrinsic value terms. We primed intrinsic values. That's our experimental condition. And what we found when we then later on, this is about 3 months after we started communicating with people, we asked them to say how important are social and conservation causes for you. And we found that both those who had received texts about conservation and those who had received texts about disability, people's disability, both the VAU and the control were relatively low in importance. Relatively low, that's the important thing. They still had pretty high, but it was relatively low. On the other hand, those who had a lot of priming of intrinsic values, they were reminded of the fact that we do share one world, we do care about that world, we have reason to care. They were reminded about that time and time again for 3 months. These people placed more value on social and conservation causes. We also asked them, how much do you intend to support conservation and disability causes, both in terms of the money you give, the donations you give, the petitions you're willing to sign in support of these causes, so your civic engagement, your non-financial engagement, and generally speaking, how much do you support these conservation organizations and disability organizations. And again, these effects are consistent across disability causes and conservation causes. We found that people were generally low in these things, both in our control and VAU. Again, this is relative. But our experimental condition where we primed intrinsic values across 3 months, they said, yes, I would be willing to donate. Yes, I would be willing to send petitions. Yes, I do support conservation causes and disability causes. Okay, so this is the direct way we can prime people's intrinsic values directly by using words that are associated with them. We can also activate people's intrinsic values indirectly. And what I'd like to argue is when we have meaningful contact with nature, we feel that sense of caring. We feel that sense of concern for other people and the world around us. And so our intrinsic values increase. So we thought one way to do that is by teaching people about natural environments. Now, a lot of the public, if you were to ask them about specific bird species, tree species, ecosystems, they would be able to tell you relatively little. And actually, there's been some research in the UK that has shown that it's embarrassingly little when you're looking at today's generation. The idea is, can we potentially increase caring for nature by teaching people about these specific characteristics, traits, attributes, quirks that animals have, that perhaps plants have, that make them special, make them interesting? Can we get people interested in nature by teaching them about nature? And the first thing we did was we coded a bunch of real ads from 14 different conservation organizations, including the WWF, including the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, as well as other, these were all UK-based conservation organizations. So we coded representative advertisements that they had sent out to their general public for how much did they actually educate people about a specific species or a specific ecosystem. Or how much did they just say, hey, can you help us out, without educating people? And what we found was those real-life advertisements that tended to inform people about those attributes and characteristics of animals, plants, and ecosystems, they tended to be more successful. They were responded to more positively. They tended to excite people's willingness to support conservation causes. And relatedly, we did an experiment where we then said, okay, well, can we show causal support for this? Can we actually test whether, if we teach people about nature, they are more likely to support conservation causes? These are a lot of studies, guys. So hopefully we will bring it all together. But we did a study bringing it back to the lab, and we randomly assigned people to one of three conditions here. In one, we had a video of animals, and we did it as well with a forest, but I'm going to talk about the study with animals. We had a video with animals, and the screen was just blank. It had animals going in and out of it, looking kind of cute, and sometimes cuddly. Usually they were not always cuddly animals, but it was a kind of charming video. In a second condition, we had that same video, but now we added words and sentences that were designed to argue these animals are in danger because of what people have done. So this is what we call the extinction condition. It's our typical argument that is often used in conservation, that we have to help because otherwise horrible things are going to happen to these species. Now this is a very understandable argument, it's a very good argument, but perhaps it is most convincing for those people who already care about conservation, and less convincing for the general public who may say, well, okay, so, this bird species might not be around for very long, but, why does that matter to me? So we had this extinction condition, and then we had an information condition where we taught people about nature in a personal way. We said, hey, this snake does X and so forth. This bird does Y. So we tried to personalize nature, to bring it and make people feel more connected to it. And then we looked at conservation behaviors. And so what we found, we looked at negative emotions, that is, how anxious, upset, or angry do you feel right now. We also looked at how caring or concerned I feel right now. And what we found was that in the information condition, people had lower negative affect, and they reported higher caring. By making people meaningfully connect with nature, they actually felt generally happier and more caring. Whereas in the extinction condition, and again, this is a study with students who probably did not come in with a high level of conservation awareness or concern to begin with. But it seems like extinction messages in their own, they increase negative affect and they did not increase caring as compared to our neutral video that just had animals. So if we just use extinction messages, if we just say, dudes, we're in trouble if we don't do anything, it seems like with the general public that doesn't do anything in terms of how caring people and concerned people feel. But if we can meaningfully connect people to nature, we can see a direct benefit. And so then we looked at behavior. We did that in a number of ways. One was we looked at the amount of time people spent on the WWF website. So this was kind of a measure of how much attention they were willing to give to conservation causes. So what we did was we put people in front of a computer and said, hey, check it out, for as long as you want. And then we had a research assistant behind a one-way mirror, kind of creepy, with a little timer. And we had them time how long the people were actually on there. And we found that compared to just animals, extinction messages did not lead people to spend more time on the WWF website, but meaningfully connecting with nature did have an effect. And then we asked people, well, how much money would you donate to WWF? Same thing, no benefit of extinction. This is not significantly different, but a benefit of information. Now this is hypothetically, how much are you willing to give? It's not quite the same, so we did get, we do see a wide range here, but it's indicative of the fact that people tended to care more when they had meaningful contact with nature. Okay. So these are, again, a bunch of different studies brought together, but the thing that I'm trying to argue with you here is that we can encourage conservation behavior, we can encourage caring for nature by using psychological theory to inform certain strategies. And in this case, the strategies we used were priming intrinsic values, activating them directly, and activating them indirectly through meaningful contact with nature. So we used values theory in this case to inform how we want to connect to people around nature. So again, this is something that I think will be really interesting to pursue in the future because this is preliminary evidence here that this kind of meaningful contact makes a difference. The other point that I'd like to hit home is that we don't have to think about conservation as antagonistic to people. We don't have to think about, okay, the more money we put in conservation, the less money we have for helping disabled people or helping impoverished people. We don't have to think about conservation and society as being two separate things that have a tension with one another. Instead, what we can aim to do is to create a culture of giving and caring that then leads people to conserve nature and at the same time to care more for one another by using strategies like activating intrinsic values, strategies that tend to make people more caring in general, both towards nature and towards other people. So again, we don't have to think either we put our efforts to conservation causes or we put our efforts to making the world a better place for people. The two seem to go hand in hand. Different way of thinking about it. Okay, more concretely, what this research implies is that there are benefits to excursions out. If you live away from nature, there are benefits to going out and seeking meaningful contact with nature. And previous research has shown those benefits are to yourself, to well-being. This research suggests that that benefit is also to your relationships with other people and potentially to society. And so this implication for society is really important. It's important that we recognize that if we can integrate nature into society, society as a whole benefits, not just a few key individuals or a few individuals here or there, but we can actually make our community a better, more caring place by integrating nature into it. And again, then I want to highlight that conservation and society go hand in hand. We can think about one fostering the other, and we can think about meaningful contact with nature as fostering both. And these kind of benefits potentially have a trickle-down effect that has substantial economic benefits. That is, if we can have people have meaningful contact with nature, if we can get people connected to nature, they have stronger relationships, they have higher well-being. That makes them healthier, they're less likely to seek medical help, they're more productive at work, potentially, they learn better at school, and in a whole host of other ways, we can see practical benefits to society as well as relational benefits. Do I have time? talked about cities versus nature. Well, that's kind of a blunt instrument, isn't it? It's very broad, it's non-descriptive. So the question is, can we isolate certain types of nature perhaps are more beneficial than others? Perhaps the nature that is untouched by man or less touched by man, wild nature, is actually more beneficial to have contact with that kind of nature. It's more beneficial to people than having contact with perhaps a golf course or perhaps a city park. So the question is, are there added benefits? Are there added benefits to having birds around in your trees, or do you just need the trees and really the birds can all go away, we wouldn't even notice the difference? So we need to begin to isolate these, the added benefits of having different species and so forth. And part of that is looking at the added benefit of biodiversity, not just nature versus urban, but is it the more species we have or the more individuals we have, do those kinds of things actually have added incremental benefit over just being in nature? So can we see improvement to relationships and well-being when we add more types of birds, more types of trees, and so forth? Okay, we can also, this is going deep into psychology and away from applied, but we can begin to look not just at behavior and emotions, but at the way that nature impacts the brain, and I think that's a really interesting, potentially, way to go with it. There are things, for example, we can look at brain responding that is indicative of caring and empathy. Can we see that nature directly impacts empathy in the brain? That would be a really fascinating thing to see. And we can explore these relations looking at day-to-day benefits and long-term benefits. So from day to day, how does this impact? You know, if I had a day where I went to the park instead of just stayed inside, do I actually have more meaningful conversations with other people that day? That would be a really fascinating thing. As well as if I have long-term exposure to nature, does that have a benefit for me over the lifetime, as opposed to, you know, just that day that I happened to go out and see nature, that was a good day for me, but tomorrow I could be a real jerk again. You know, so we need to see the long-term benefits and look at the health implications of these kinds of well-being and relationship benefits. Okay, thank you everybody.
Okay, again, we have time for 1 to 2 questions. Johannes.
Two questions. The first one is, do you have any ideas about the evolutionary background of the response or reaction of people? And the second is half a comment, half a question is that all your examples are highly visual and intellectual. I guess most subconscious things work through smell and noise and feeling and so on. So have you also experimented with these elements?
Yeah, so in terms of the first question, I think evolutionarily the way that we think about it is that communities did exist integrated into nature earlier on. So we've moved away from our sort of natural state of living with other people to an artificial state, having storefronts around us and advertisements and all these things is a way of relating and communicating with others that is not natural to us, that is not natural to our ancestors. So it is possible that from an evolutionary perspective, we have learned to have successful communities in nature. And it might have been that nature plays an integral role in that for that reason. And your second question was?
Visual versus
yes, and the answer to that is no. We have not. We've really primarily relied on visual stimuli. The only exception was actually a recent study I did used videos of birds that had both visual and auditory stimuli, but we've never looked at auditory stimuli, for example, without visual stimuli. So I don't know how much of that is due to, again, just seeing the images, and how much of it is other experiences of nature. I think that'd be a really interesting place to take it.
I actually think that's the key to the whole understanding of the process, because living in a city basically means you're out of touch with nature, and all the impressions you get there are so overwhelming that you
Okay. One last short question.
Sorry, I'm not completely convinced about the first part.
Okay, fair enough.
Because I could formulate completely different hypotheses about it. Because I can say, if you show a picture of nature instead of urban environment, I'm a little bit more relaxed because I speak about just relaxation, and then I'm completely different because I'm just more in a relaxed mode, though I'm feeling more. Though I would need some other perhaps pictures maybe are in a relaxed mode than looking at urban environment. And also the other idea, if I think about being in nature, to be in a forest, I have to care more for the other people because there's nobody else around. Though this would be a completely different idea. It's not about nature, it's about that you think in nature you should care more for each other, but in the town, yeah, there should be the mother around. Though
Yeah,
I
it's
don't
possible
believe
that
I don't believe it's really nature.
yeah. Well, it's possible that on an implicit level, actually, those types of processes do occur. So it is possible that some of the reason that we see this effect is, when we're in natural environments, we are drawn to taking care of other people because on some level we feel that is our responsibility. But actually, I would say that would then support the relation that we see between nature and relationships. It would help to explain it. And it is very possible that these types of mechanisms are responsible. They might be a little hard to identify, but they might be driving this effect for sure. I can see your point that when people are in natural environments, they might be happier and more amenable to saying yes, I care, and so forth. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe that positive mood and that relaxation is part of what makes people, well, either respond in more positive ways, but we do see that translating into behavior in the lab as well. So perhaps acting in more prosocial ways as well. But those kind of mechanisms, I think, are our next step in terms of exploring why we're seeing these benefits of nature.
Okay, thank you very much.